Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Attracta Ivrin, and I work on a project initiative called Environmental Law Ireland, which is concerned with the protection of the environment through the proper transposition and implementation of environmental law. I'm joined here this morning by Phoebe Duval, the Planning and Policy Officer in An Taisce. And I asked Phoebe to join me to talk about a really serious issue, which is a change that has been proposed on the rules for judicial review, on the costs rules for judicial review in environmental decision making, specifically planning. Now, many of you listening here will sort of immediately want to switch off because you think, oh, judicial review, that's something got to do with me, and planning is boring. But please bear with us. This will impact you. Everyone knows that even if you never intend walking through the doors of the court to hold public authorities and the state to account, that it is really important that someone can, that they know that they can be held to account. And planning affects virtually everything that we experience in our daily lives. From we get up in the morning and wonder whether we can turn on the taps to brush our teeth, or whether we have to actually boil water, whether we consider there will be space on the bus to take us to work or to school, or whether there will be sufficient capacity, and the balancing of development with all of those public transportation needs, and a whole plethora of other matters. So basically, the government has announced in a consultation yesterday on the 3rd of December that it is going to make a significant change to the rules on judicial review. And this has been preempted and preceded by an orchestration of a really negative narrative around judicial review. And our concern is that this consultation is effectively being buried over the Christmas and New Year holiday period, and that a lot of people won't actually wake up to the reality of what it means until it's too late and have missed the opportunity for submission. So what we're planning to do today is just to take you briefly through some key points that we think are very relevant, that people should understand. Well, as I'm speaking now, this is actually a re-recording of the introduction that we did to the webinar that we did on the 4th of December, because I messed up and forgot to say, was everybody happy to have it record? So at one point we will switch to the original recording, but we're just going to go through some of these introductory remarks in a re-recorded session. So Phoebe, if you wouldn't mind just moving to the next slide. Really what we're going to do this morning is, following this introduction, is I've asked Phoebe to join me here today to specifically take us through the current rules on costs for judicial review in environmental cases, because we feel that that is really essential in order for people to fully appreciate the impact and implications for them, for ordinary people, community groups and ENGOs across the country, of what these changes are actually going to mean, and for the wider public, and the potential slide that there is going to be in judicial review, we fear, across multiple other areas. Then we're going to talk about what's proposed and its implications, and take you through that at a very high level, and we're hoping that we will have an opportunity to revisit in subsequent webinars and discussions and briefings with yourselves and others, the broader implications of what's proposed. We're also going to talk about the wider context in terms of what this means for judicial review and access to justice and public accountability, and various other changes that are actually being proposed, and I'll touch on that in various different parts of the presentation. We're going to look a little bit at the specifics of the consultation and highlight what the government has put in front of you, and indeed what it hasn't. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we hope to do in this Scales of Justice campaign, which we hope will be sort of a very broad umbrella, a very broad church, bringing together people from a whole different range of sectors, not just ENGOs, but different NGOs and just individual members of the public and other organisations who are concerned about the implications of this and access to justice, and or wish to just find out more. And then we're going to have a little bit of a discussion and a Q&A, because we really need your help. We are really convinced that the government is trying to bury this consultation and its implications by virtue of the fact that it's being done over Christmas, where they have had well over a year, and indeed years, to look at what they're proposing here. And we're anxious to hear from you to try and answer some of your initial questions. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Phoebe and thank her again for responding to a very hurried ask to mount this presentation just very quickly, so that we had an opportunity to not let this week go past without just giving our perspective and raising the alert basically in relation to what's happening. And Phoebe, I'm hoping what you're going to do is take us a little bit through the practicalities of the way the current cost rules work and what that means for ordinary people, and how it has enabled them, but without opening the floodgates, and some of the automatic safeguards that actually happen with the way the current cost rules work. And that will set a good background basically for us then to consider the implications of the changes proposed. So over to you, Phoebe. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Attracta. So yeah, as you said, we'll start with a look at the current cost rules.
And I would just emphasize, sorry to jump back in, what we're looking at here is a paradigm shift in terms of the state assuming control over the quality of representation that you will be able to mount and take in a challenge against them when you want to hold them to account. So it's a paradigm shift. It's a profound change in access to justice in Ireland. Thank you.
It absolutely is. So let's dive into it. So, yeah, just to initially touch on the current rules, basically the way that legal costs in general have worked in Ireland until we get to talking about the special cost rules here is that the loser pays. But the thing is, taking a court case here is actually really, really expensive. We have some of the highest legal fees in Europe. So you could easily be looking at tens of thousands of euro, if not hundreds of thousands. And that applies including, to planning and environmental cases. And it's also important to bear in mind that you can have multiple parties to a case. It may not, say in a planning case, it may not just be you, the litigant, and on commission planala. You could have the state, the AG, you could have the developer as a notice party. So all of these contribute to why costs are so high. So Ireland and the EU are both parties to the Aarhus Convention on the rights to public participation and access to justice in environmental decision-making. And one of the key principles of Aarhus is that proceedings that fall under the Aarhus umbrella can't be prohibitively expensive. So Ireland introduced special cost rules specifically to bring us into compliance with Aarhus and to make sure that taking environmental cases wasn't prohibitively expensive. And under these current rules, each side bears its own costs. But if you win your case, it's possible for you to be awarded some or all of your costs back. And this means that for people, NGOs, members of the public taking environmental cases, it can allow you to take them on what we call a no full, no fee basis. So basically, you can engage a lawyer and they only get paid if you win. And this is really important because it not only helps ordinary people and NGOs who are typically under-resourced and who otherwise wouldn't necessarily be able to afford to take a case, it helps them access justice, essentially. And the other thing is, though, that it also functions as kind of an important safeguard to ensure that the cases that are taken are actually legally robust. Because the weaker cases are usually weeded out because lawyers are unlikely to take them, since if they don't win, they won't be paid. And it's one of the crucial things about the current rules is that they don't just cover planning cases, but they cover cases taken under a whole range of environmental matters. So the implications of changing the rules, it's not just about planning, it's about the environmental cases much more broadly. A good example of that, Antashka is currently taking a case on the Nitrates Action Program, and that's not a planning issue, that's a policy issue, but it does cover that. The current cost rules do cover that. And just to give you a sense of the scale of these issues, in that case, there's Antashka, there's the Department of Housing, there's 2 notice parties, there have been 3 High Court hearings already, and there's another hearing in the European Court next week. So that means that the legal fees are already sky high, hundreds of thousands. So from a practical perspective, with the current cost rules, even with them, taking a case is actually still very difficult, and it's not something that anyone undertakes lightly. From an NGO perspective, NGOs are generally under-resourced, so can't afford to pay lawyers, so are very reliant on being able to take cases on the no full, no fee basis. There's a very small pool of lawyers that are willing to actually work on that basis, and huge amounts of work go into preparing the grounds, getting approval from management structures and the board, weighing up the risks of taking the case, the benefits. So it's already a very, very high bar. And that bar is even higher, I would say, for small communities who might need to challenge a decision. They're often not doing this work as part of their normal jobs. So they may be extremely time constrained, having to do this in their spare time. They may not have relationships with lawyers like many NGOs do. We're very fortunate that we work closely with many excellent lawyers, but that may not be the case for communities, and that adds a layer of complication for them. And environmental law is also hugely complex and dynamic. It's changing all the time, and that takes a lot to get to grips with. And obviously there's the issue of costs. There's huge financial risk for communities, even with the current cost rules. So there's a lot of barriers. And there's also times when communities are dealing with, say a planning application over a very long period of time, or, multiple times, like the cases currently with the now infamous Ringaskiddy incinerator. So you have all of these elements that make taking an environmental case quite difficult under the current cost rules, but the potential changes, which Attract is about to talk about, could really shut out ordinary people, communities, NGOs from being able to take environmental cases. But at the same time, big developers and other wealthy interests will be pretty much unhindered. So on that, Attract, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much for that, Phoebe, and we appreciate that for some of you that will be old hat. Actually, maybe you just sit back to that slide for a second, that first slide, Phoebe, for a second. Thanks. But for some of you, it'll be a lot to digest. So part of what we want to do over this campaign is just to help people getting a handle. So we will be revisiting this so that we can go back over that. I would just emphasize that the changes weren't just introduced in response to the requirements of the Aarhus Convention, but also basically to comply with wider obligations under EU law, and are actually also important constitutionally, just given the extent of barrier that costs actually presented in this sphere. So they have facilitated a degree of litigation flowing. There wasn't a flood, there wasn't an opening of literally floodgates when they were introduced back in 2011. We all know that there was a spike associated with the very problematic, controversial strategic housing development provisions and the flaws in decision making that arose consequent on that, compounded by very unfortunate issues within what was then on board Planola. But the really important thing is that they have facilitated a flow of litigation. And it is not without risk still, and that these are fundamentally now going to be effectively disbanded, thrown out with the baby and the bathwater. And they were introduced effectively, and this is the fundamental thing, and why I've got this chain link fence here with a big X across it. They were to remove costs as a barrier. That was the primary motivation in it. But now, as we move on to what we're seeing now, and Phoebe, if you'll flip over, basically what's being proposed is effectively being introduced with the government being absolutely unabashed as an intention to create a barrier on access to justice. So that's what these new rules that are being set out in the consultation are being proposed. Yes, I just see a query around the slides. Yes, we will share the slides afterwards. So basically, these new rules draw on the changes made in the Planning and Development Act 2024, Chapter 2, Part 9 of that specifically. And they basically provide for the Minister, in conjunction with consultations with the Housing Minister and the Minister for Justice, and the Minister responsible for Public Expenditure, National Development Plan Delivery and Reform, to consult and to make basically DCEE, basically then to make regulations which are ultimately approved in this instance by Minister Jack Chamber, with responsibility for public expenditure, national development plan delivery and reform. And the idea is that they will impose specific rates of fees for specific types of work, and that those rates will limit the award that you can win if you win your challenge. So they will be limited to the fee and rates set by these new regulations. So the implication of that, first off the bat, is even if you win, you may still end up with a substantial legal bill, as your lawyers may need to engage with you at a higher rate than those rates that are proposed by the court in order to be competitive. The courts will have very limited discretion to vary those rates, according to the provisions in the Act. And these can be changed at the flick of a ministerial pen. Or so they can be ratcheted down if the state decides to go that way, or left to stagnate and not be kept pace with developments in the profession or in the rates in other sectors. However, importantly also, the other side, the respondents, the state and the notice parties, so the developers for the project underlying the decision being challenged, are not going to be so restricted. So fundamentally, the way I see it, and Phoebe, if you can just flick on now to the next slide, is that we're going to be left with a completely unlevel playing field. Effectively, it's a bit like me saying, let's play a game of football, Phoebe. But by the way, I'm effectively going to be telling you who you can pick for your team and how long they can stay on the pitch for. And by the way, I'll be choosing my team from the Premier League, and I have no budgetary constraints. But I'm going to determine the purse that you have in order to choose your team and how long and how much effort effectively that they can put into the game against me. So this is going to raise very serious legal issues in terms of unfairness and inequity, key characteristics that are required legally and on which Ireland has obligations. And that's likely to cause legal argument. And with legal argument, you have delays, you have costs, you have complexities, you have uncertainties. I always joke that grey is a lawyer's favourite colour. And there's an awful lot of greyness and issue associated with these proposals. And where you have uncertainty and delay, then you have developers, and cases and applications holding back because they don't know what's going to happen. So instead of facilitating much needed housing and infrastructure, critical infrastructure, which we all know we need for critical things like the energy crisis, etc., and our energy transition, are likely to be delayed rather than expedited by these changes. If you can move on to the next slide there. But we've been hearing endlessly, and you'll see when you start to read the consultation report documents, this works fine in the UK, but it doesn't. That's the simple fact of the matter. It does not. There are serious problems with this approach in the UK. The only reason that the EU Commission dropped infringement proceedings against the UK because of its cost rules was because of Brexit, and they effectively escaped the net of the EU Commission and the CJEU. Also, the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee has made findings against the UK on costs, and in response to that, they have come forward with their Aarhus COP rules, which basically limit the exposure and limit the award, so somewhat similar to what has been proposed in Ireland, but there are issues with those, particularly for smaller NGOs. Because even if you think about it just for one moment, and you look at Phoebe there, we'll say, in the National Trust for Ireland, and you compare her to the National Trust for the UK. Well, let's think about the membership of the National Trust of the UK. It's effectively the entire population of Ireland. The entire population of Ireland. Think about what that means in terms of membership fees. Think about what it means in terms of the portfolio of property, rental properties, farming, accommodation, everything, the commercial operations associated with the National Trust. It's shops, it's properties and visitations, it's car parking, the employment law. All of these different things mean that they are a very lucrative and important client for UK legal service providers, a very prestigious client for UK legal service providers, and therefore there is a willingness basically to take judicial review for organisations like that, even if it means running at a loss for the legal professionals involved. But most NGOs and most members of the public aren't in a similar position, and this is creating real issues within the UK. And the structural differences between us and our size, and indeed the fact that we don't have a chambers model whereby lawyers operate together and can also raise the offering that they can offer in terms of corporate social responsibility, means that we are structurally very significantly different. And that is absolutely nowhere addressed in this consultation report. So if we can just move on for a moment, then it's also important, and I'm conscious we're running out of time already, is that there was supposed to be another set of regulations on a legal aid scheme, which when this was going through was seen to sort of take some of the pain out of the proposals, albeit there are very serious issues with the legal aid scheme. But it's now very clear that while the legislation is currently drafted as this being a bird with two wings and both sets of regulations needing to go together, that they are not proposing to move on the second set of regulations at this point in time, and may indeed absolutely decouple them and may never offer that aid scheme. If we can move on, Phoebe. So the consultation on the associated report, it outlines the underlying legislation, and I haven't gone into this in painful detail talking about sections today because we just wanted to get some high-level messages across, but we can do that in further sessions. It talks about the difficulties in coming up with rates, and this is a really important point in terms of the evidence base and what has been relied upon for coming up with these rates. It talks a little bit about the process that's been undertaken, and I would say highlights the effective lack of transparency that there has been around that. It inventorizes the work that is undertaken in proceedings, and it breaks proceedings up into phases. It considers that there is varying complexity in cases, some being very complex, some being just complex, some being just sort of standard. And it basically decides to leave that determination of different tiers of rates basically to be determined by the court, which is going to basically leave us all in a completely uncertain position in relation to what degree of claim or award you can expect from your courts. So we're right back to the chilling uncertainty that some of you will remember from the original court case against Ireland and costs C42707, where the discretion of the courts was considered by the court to be an unacceptable level of uncertainty and to create a chilling situation for applicants. It then goes on to propose a series of rates for the different categories that it sets out, and it asks a number of specific questions. The key thing I suppose we wanted to highlight today, in addition to just the fundamental paradigm shift that there is with the state ultimately now having complete control over the quality of challenge that you can effectively mount when taking it on. And that's the key thing. The state will have complete control effectively for most of us of the quality of the challenge that you can take, that you can make when you are challenging the lawfulness of its decisions. Is that they're running a consultation on this and burying it over the Christmas New Year holiday period, with the concluding at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday the 15th of January. And that's despite our urging, and I would thank the environmental pillar in particular for its support in writing and seeking a realistic period. But at this point in time, they seem to be sticking with their guns of the 15th of January, and I'm not optimistic that that will change. That's a link to the consultation, and if we can move very briefly on, Phoebe, to the next thing. There's a series of questions there, basically asking in detail about the proposed approach, the specifics of the criteria that they've set out, the trigger points, the levels of fees, the inventories of work, all of those different things. And I think it's really important not to just lose sight of the big picture here. This is a fundamental shift. This is going to put the state in control. So I think it's really dangerous to get drawn into the nitty-gritty of the rates, the categories, the inventories, how good, bad, or indifferent they are. This is a fundamental paradigm shift which undermines the rule of law and public accountability. And it is consistent with what we are seeing in multiple sectors, is a fundamental undermining of civil society. So that number 9, please provide submissions on any other aspect of this consultation with reasons for your proposal. This is where Attractive will be going into rant mode. So if we can just move on there, Phoebe. I think the other thing we really wanted to emphasize again is just to have a bit of context here, that this is but one of multiple moving parts impacting on judicial review rights. And don't get us wrong, we do share the concern that there is in relation to, undoubtedly there is a significant level of judicial review, but if you look at it in the context of the overall amounts of decisions, you will have seen various different articles by me, Orla Kelleher, Clodagh, Lorcan Sur, and others, highlighting the extent to which the small proportion of decisions that are actually being subject to judicial review, and the extent that judicial review numbers reflect not just decisions being taken by the public and ENGOs, but also JRs increasingly being taken more and more by developers challenging decisions. So there is also new interpretations and application of the current rules by the courts, some of which are deeply concerning. So we're facing a moving target, many of us thought, with Heather Hill back in 2022, that we had sort of reached an equilibrium and a degree of clarity, and there was a great breathing of a sigh of relief across the board from lawyers on all sides in relation to finally actually having clarity in relation to the way the rules were to be interpreted. But the state wasn't happy with the implications of that, and it moved immediately to bring forward changes in the Planning and Development Act. But also earlier this year, we have seen new rules of the Superior Courts for the Planning and Environmental Court, introduced in around June or July of this year. We have new and evolving practice directions for the Planning and Environment Court. Now we're seeing that in earnest, the changes that were enacted in the 2024 Act, and which we highlighted at the time were gravely concerning, are now being acted upon. They are seeking to commence them and to bring in the regulations that they provide for. And that's what that big one in bold is what we are currently looking at in this consultation. But they're also proposing further changes to the 2000 Act, as far as we know, which to engage the restrictions of the 2024 Act on judicial review. So they're basically, while the 2024 Act was supposed to apply to decisions taken under the 2024 Act, they're effectively spreading the love and basically spreading those restrictions into decisions. And that's going to be an absolute nightmare, particularly in relation to decisions where public participation will have been informed by the approach to standing under the 2000 Act, which is materially different under the 2024 Act. They're also then going to take the changes which are in the 2024 Act and extend them across all of the other environmental sectors. Because some of you will know that the current cost rules, even though they're in the Planning and Development Act 2000, they actually work across sectors. So even if they're in planning, they will cover things like judicial review in forestry or aquaculture or oil and gas development, etc., because they're attached to directives effectively, and because of the way that they're structured and worded in that 2000 Act. But the 2024 Act limits them to planning. But very importantly, I think it's really important to emphasize that there are now a whole range of other actors who are captured by the restrictive rules on standing, the restrictive 8-week window. It's not just planning authorities and on Commission and Planola. It's the government, it's ministers, it's the Office of the Planning Regulator, it's noise authorities in Dublin Airport, it's the regional authorities. So there's about 7 different, if memory serves, relevant bodies whose decisions will now fall under these new rules. There's also changes proposed to the Civil Reform Bill, and there are ongoing developments at the CJEU level. So we have about 8 moving parts. So there's a hell of a lot of grey out there, a hell of a lot of change, and all of that is going to drive uncertainty and legal argument. If we can move on then, Phoebe. So our Scale of Fees campaign is basically Scale of Fees is a scale of justice issue. It's fundamentally tipping the balance on the scales of justice is the logic behind our image. What we're trying to do is create, in the first instance, awareness of the consultation, giving the timing and the intention, the clear intention, in my view, to bury it over the holiday period. We all know people use their stolen hours, members of the public use their stolen hours in the evenings and at weekends to do these types of consultations and to engage in this type of activity. But over Christmas and New Year, that time is long since booked and committed on pain of divorce and whatever, to meet with friends and families. So you don't have that discretion. You will have a very, very limited time to engage on something that the state has taken well over a year to develop and has a lot of expert input in assisting it come forward. So we really need your help on this. Many of you have run really highly successful campaigns, have really wide networks, and we're really, really looking at you to help us get the word out. And thank you so much for the really warm offers of help and encouragement that we've got so far in this. But what we need to make sure is that we don't walk out of here today and just slip into Christmas tree mode and basically then suddenly find the 15th has crept up on us. We need to first press for an extension. We've already been doing that. It hasn't been going well. We were pressing for the extension before it was announced because we expected that it was going to be bad. And unfortunately, our fears have been realised. We want to mobilise responses. We think it's really important that people have a chance, whatever their view, to actually respond on this consultation, but particularly for those who actually see this as being problematic and undermining access to justice in the Irish courts. We're going to try and provide considerations to help people and to assist responses. So some template pointers, etc. And we'll be working on that and would welcome assistance in relation to that. But really importantly, it's about mobilising wider political pressure and to press for what's really needed here to address the fundamental issues of concern, around problems delivering critical infrastructure and housing in Ireland. Let's have a proper review. Like the government is talking about problems with planning. The ink is not yet dry on the pages of the 2024 Act that they have just enacted on foot of their review, closed door review, I might add, of planning. And yet they're now saying that planning is a problem and that they need to do more. So let's have a meaningful review and reform to address the wider legal costs issues and what can be done to transition to a better regime and a fairer regime on that, to look at what is ultimately driving JR and what is needed to facilitate sustainable development. Phoebe, if you can just move on to the next slide. So now we really I know time is short, but we'd really like maybe just to hear from you. We know that many of you will have questions. We apologise, that was a bit of a brain dump. It's a bit rough and ready, but we didn't want this week to slip by without actually sort of doing some wider outreach and engagement. And thank you for your time so far. Stunned silence. Does anybody want to raise a hand? Christopher, Phoebe, can you unmute yourself there, Christopher? And you might just introduce yourself, Christopher. I know who you are, but it would be very helpful if you could. Can you unmute? Maybe Phoebe, can you unmute?
No, I can't, unfortunately.
Okay.
Christopher, why don't you type your question into the chat if you can, and we can come back to it.
I think we're going to have the same problem with everybody. Is there a default setting? Apologies for this.
Miriam Mooney here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Miriam, we can hear you.
Well, I just changed the mic setting at the top of the screen. I'm not a great IT person, but I could do that.
Yeah.
And just thank you all for this great presentation about an absolutely alarming and very concerning plan that maybe we're all stunned into horrified silence. Might be partly why people aren't saying anything, but thank you so much. And it's important we all galvanize. Thank you.
Thanks a million for that encouragement. Christopher, you'll see a little mic symbol if you click on the people icon or on just the mic icon, and actually just try and just click on that, and it should flip into the other mode. I'm particularly anxious to hear from Christopher, knowing his engagement with FLAC. But in the meantime, maybe we'll try and move to Sabrina. If you can unmute yourself, Sabrina.
Hi, yeah, obviously as shocked as everybody else, knew it was coming. But I think one of the most important things that we can do is tying in as much as possible to the primary legislation at EU level in a clear and effective way. I'm thinking along the lines of sort of Article 47, obstructing effective judicial protection. I'm also concerned about the fact that, you know, asking the court to decide whether something is complex, non-complex, or not is effectively asking the court to kind of implement executive policy by identifying, you know, what costs, you know, that there's no kind of, we have no definition, first of all, of exactly what is complex or non-complex under the law, which is going to be the first issue. So we're talking about satellite litigation almost to identify, is it complex or not? I think another issue is that obviously this is a very human-centric approach, because it's, you know, it's an environmental court. It's supposed to be about the environment. The environment is more than just, you know, humans. So this idea of the common good, what is the common good? Is it only human-centric, or does it, you know, include all the species that are protected under the Habitats Directive? Now, we also have to consider the fact that the Habitats Directive, Birds Directive, etc., specifically says that economic and social concerns cannot trump protection of the sites and the precautionary principle. So on some level, we have to tie that into if there is no effective access to justice to protect, you know, habitats and species that are protected under those directives, and that economic concerns, i.e., you know, the length of time that these infrastructural developments have to wait, or the costs involved to the board, if they are trumping the protection of species, then, you know, we can't be considering the economic concerns. I think that's something that we have to tie in whenever we're doing anything. They're just some of my first comments anyway.
All right, so just start typing, Sabrina, is what I would say.
I have my notes already, I will.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm just going to try and briefly move to Christopher now. I think he's managed to unmute, and then I'll come back to you, Ciara. My apologies. Okay, thanks very much. Christopher.
Hi, everyone. I think I'm sorted now. Sorry, I had some technological issues there. Thanks a million for organising this attractor. That was extremely helpful. I suppose in FLAC, we were really stunned by the scope of what was announced yesterday. Obviously, the mood music has been dire, but I mean, really, the proposals are, while being quite nebulous at the moment, they're extremely far-reaching. And I suppose it's important when we're engaging with any aspect of it, and the consultation going on at the moment is extremely limited. It's important, I think, to keep an eye on that bigger picture, that taken together, these would be, you know, really extreme restrictions on access to the courts in a way we haven't seen, I think, in decades in Ireland. And I suppose one point I'd keep in mind, that in addition to the environmental law elements, there is a constitutional right of access to the courts in Ireland. And I think that's an area that needs to be examined, specifically around the scale of the scale of fees issue, but also the comments in the infrastructure plan around examining no phone, no fee arrangements. And I think the language around that is so fudgy in the plan, because they know there are those potential issues in relation to it. So I suppose that's a point we'd be keeping in mind. And then I suppose the other thing is the ask. I suppose it's sort of hidden in the detail of the plan that it includes the civil reform bill. So it's rather extraordinary that an infrastructure plan includes proposals that will affect judicial reviews in areas like citizenship, social housing, social welfare. It goes far beyond delivery of housing and infrastructure alone. So that's another point to bear in mind on this. So to I think in formulating our ask, we need to really be saying, in light of the kind of global nature of these proposals, I think the ask needs to be for a sort of global consultation on this issue of judicial review and access of the courts, because you mentioned, Attracted, the lack of consultation on the Planning and Development Now Act. But I mean, the Kelly Review, which has led to the Civil Reform Bill, also had a completely unsatisfactory consultation process, and the recommendations in the Kelly report, which have now led to the Civil Reform Bill proposals, they're completely at odds with the evidence on what you'd call standard or general judicial review. So there's no case for raising the leave threshold for judicial review in the way the Kelly Review and now the Civil Reform Bill suggests. In fact, the evidence points to the need to remove that leave threshold at the early stage. So I suppose we're still in the process of, figuring out how to respond to all of this. But I suppose what we're trying to do is put together some response that looks at the need to examine all these issues in a sort of broad-based, evidence-based, sort of inclusive way, rather than falling into the trap of allowing the government essentially to set the terms of the debate by bringing forward, sort of narrow proposals in a sort of ragtag ad hoc way, piecemeal effectively, and then also setting the terms of the consultations to only look at small elements of those. So just to make sure our ask goes beyond this, the narrow confines that they might be setting, because certainly the overall plan, as articulated in the infrastructure plan, goes to judicial review and access to the courts in a much more global way. So I know time is limited, so I'll stop there.
No, that's been extremely helpful, Christopher, and I couldn't agree with you more. I would just highlight also that it's quite egregious, because the Peter Kelly Review, are to be relying on the Peter Kelly Review and saying that the Civil Reform Bill changes are going to actually impact upon planning and environmental review, because statutory review was specifically excluded from scope from the Peter Kelly Review, and explicitly planning judicial review, because the 2019 heads of bill had actually come forward and been tabled at that time. But there is, without question, and we're getting into a lot of detail here, reliance on the views within the minority report and proposals in relation to legal fees that are being relied on here, and that is basically, risk distorting the whole playing field. But these changes basically came forward months before, indeed 4 months before, the Minister for Justice basically published a report that she had commissioned on foot of the Peter Kelly Review, given the fact that she'd do different sets of proposals. And before that was published, and the Indicon report that she commissioned indicated that there was insufficient evidence on which to base a sound policy proposal on scale of fees. So look, there's an awful lot of nerdy detail that we could get into, but I'm anxious to hear from Ciara, and I also see Phil Carney there. And I want to just touch base just at the end before we wrap up, just with some contact emails, so that we can keep in touch, because the danger and what they're ultimately relying on is that we'll all go off into wrapping Christmas presents and we won't see each other until the new year. We can't be doing that. And I really need your help, as does Phoebe. So over to you, Ciara, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Attracta, and thanks so much, everybody, for organising this. Here's the voice from Belfast, I guess. So 3 things in relation to the northern kind of angle on this. First of all, we've done a bit of work. I've put the link in the chat there on costs and comparing the kind of cost regimes and various barriers that they create to environmental justice north and south. So we had a big conference in Queens last year, which is also available to watch. So that might be interesting, because if nothing else, as Attracta pointed out, we can show exactly why the system up here doesn't work very well. And I think that it's very good to highlight some practical examples of that. So when we will be submitting to this probably in early January. But when we do that, we'll be very happy to share the kind of transboundary angle on that. The second thing I wanted to raise was that the post-Brexit arrangements in the north, for the relationship with the EU and Ireland and the UK and everything, the Windsor framework puts in place you know, provisions to stop any diminution of rights post-Brexit. We did a big report on that as well for the Human Rights Commission in the North. Now, whether or not that has any bearing here or could be impacted by these proposals is something that I think would need to be explored as well. That's something that we probably will look at too. And again, very happy to share any findings on that we have. And finally, that these are issues that I think definitely should be raised by anybody making a submission to the call for evidence by the UN Special Rapporteur, who is coming to visit in February. The deadline for that, anybody can make a submission, is next Wednesday, the 10th. And one of the issues we've raised are the disparities in access to justice and the cost regimes on both sides of the border on the island, and how that creates transboundary issues. So anybody who is making a submission to that, I'd encourage you to raise the fact that the island of Ireland is one single biogeographic unit. All citizens have a right of access to justice, and these proposals will have impacts on citizens on both sides of the border. So again, we will be sharing our response to the UN's call for evidence early next week. So that's everything from me. I'm aware we're short of time, but happy to follow up with anybody on any of that. And thanks again for organising.
Thanks a million, Ciara. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Tracta, and for organising this, and thanks, Phoebe, also. Briefly, could you just comment on the level of orchestration, which seemed to start with the Collins rant and the Collinson essay, and there's been such a pile-on in the media since. Do you see a level of orchestration there that we haven't seen before in relation to these issues?
Absolutely. I think it's been unprecedented, and I think it's been created as a cover for what is this really subversive paradigm shift, you know, to justify it and to create, I would go so far as saying, a lot of disinformation and misunderstanding and fear, and to paint judicial review and indeed the courts as bogeymen that are basically, you know, causing the problem, and to vilify people. Like, I mean, some of the people on this call, you know, have been clearly, you know, subjected to very identifiable attacks, which has been deeply disturbing and very egregious. So it is a fundamental shift in sort of a willingness to be held accountable. And I think really more importantly, it needs to be seen in the context of the overall thrust of the Planning and Development Act 2024, which allows for extraordinary centralisation of power and extraordinary ministerial and government powers to issue directions to force the whole planning system into alignment. And planning may seem like a nerdy thing, but it's the thing that impacts most of us in everything we experience in our physical world, from we get up out of bed, figure have we set the alarm clock early enough to manage to skip the traffic, you know, whether we can, you know, wash our teeth, or we have to boil the water, for all of these different types of things, you know, where the schools are, where our work is, the distances, you know, the implications for our climate, the implications for our energy production, everything is governed by planning. So it is really, really fundamental. And don't get me wrong, and I'm on record as saying this, I see the Planning and Development Act as being a coup, an effective coup in our democracy. But I do understand that where you have difficult decisions and you have crises like we do have in climate and energy and housing, that you may need to make centralised, unpopular decisions. But then you absolutely need accountability and oversight. And that is where the 2024 Act is fundamentally flawed. It pushes back on oversight by the Oireachtas, and it ultimately tries to cut off public accountability in front of the courts at the hip. And that is why I focused in particular on Part 9 and the judicial review provisions, because the rubber hits the road basically with access to justice and accountability for the lawfulness of decision makings, and to ensure there isn't an abuse of power in a country that has been subject to the most intense lobbying and planning corruption issues. We really need to be very careful here. It is not long since we were in a situation where it was only the public and the courts that actually were able to react effectively and efficiently to the issues that we saw coming out of strategic housing development, when the rest of the establishment effectively stood still, despite all the red flags. And that has left an incredible hiatus and legacy in relation to housing. I'm conscious I've run on.
Can I add one thing there, Tracta?
Of course, Phoebe.
Just in relation to that narrative, Phil, one thing that we're not seeing anyone talking about, because yes, we do need to get homes and critical infrastructure built. We're not seeing this narrative talking about, well, how do we actually ensure we get lawful, robust planning decisions? Because that's how we keep things out of courts in the first place, is good planning decisions. And that's just, you know, looking at that element of it has been completely absent. So yeah, I would agree with everything Attracta just said. You know, if we want to actually address barriers to getting critical infrastructure, that's one of the big gaps in what we're seeing coming out from government and other actors, is how do we ensure that our planning system is lawful and that it's making lawful decisions.
Yeah, I'm conscious there's a very important comment there from Caroline White in relation to, you know, just focusing on the type of Ireland that we want, you know, and a focus on a well-being society and a more sustainable, just and fair society. So these are the types of things that we need to be looking at, not just development and growth for the sake of it. But I'm really conscious of time, and we're already 4 minutes over. So Sabrina, if you'll forgive me, can I just ask you to pop your comment in the chat, and don't shoot me. But I just want to sort of finish on just sharing with you some contact email addresses and encourage you to keep in touch, to bear with us, because this comes like a bolt out of the blue. It's not entirely unexpected, but the timing is more particularly unfortunate, than we thought that they would be so bold, as to actually run with. So we'd also really welcome help from those of you who have mobilized good campaigns, who have good tech experience. But you can contact me. That's my email address. Some of you already have it. Some of you on the call, I know, haven't been directly in touch and may have just got your contacts through other people. So can you just make sure that you email us so that we have your email addresses? And you can share that with either Phoebe, myself, or both. And I've just set up a Scales of Justice Ireland. Scales of Justice was gone, which is interesting in itself. Scales of Justice Ireland at gmail.com, which hopefully will just facilitate us engaging together and sharing information and ideas. But thank you so much. It's been really heartening. I know a number of people wanted to be able to join today, but were unable to do so. But we'll hopefully be able to build a powerful response to actually demand change, the type of change and consideration and reform that's actually needed. Thank you very much.